The rain had stopped an hour before midnight, but Elara Winthrop did not notice. She sat on the old garden swing behind Bellamy Hall, her shawl damp against her shoulders, her eyes fixed on nothing at all. The chains creaked with each small, absent movement of her feet against the wet grass. She had come out here the way she always did, when the house grew too loud with other people's happiness, and too silent toward her own sorrow. Tonight, it was her father's letter, folded so many times the creases had begun to tear, that had driven her from her narrow room beneath the eaves and out into the cold garden air. She did not cry loudly. She had learned, over 3 years of living beneath her aunt's roof as a poor relation with no dowry and no prospects, that loud grief drew attention, and attention in that house was never kind. So she cried quietly, in the old way she had perfected, her breath catching without sound, her tears falling into her lap where no one would see them shine in the moonlight. She did not know that someone did see them. At the edge of the box hedge, where the shadow of the old yew tree fell longest, a man stood very still, a lantern unlit in his hand, watching a woman he had been told was merely a servant of the house weep as though her heart were breaking in complete privacy. He had come to that garden for reasons of his own, reasons that had nothing to do with tears or swings or a girl in a darned grey dress, and yet he found he could not make himself walk away. His name, as far as anyone at Bellamy Hall knew, was Julian Hale, a groundsman recently hired to assess the estate's overgrown park before the family's return to full society. That was the story his steward had arranged, the plain coat and calloused excuse for hands, the humble lodging above the stables. Only 3 men in England knew that Julian Hale did not exist, and that the man wearing his name was in truth Julian Ashworth, 9th Duke of Ravensmere, master of an estate 20 times the size of the one whose hedges he now stood behind, uninvited, unannounced, and utterly transfixed by the sight of a crying stranger who did not know she was being watched. He had come to Bellamy Hall for one reason only. His late father, in the final delirium of his illness, had extracted a promise from him that Julian would marry Cassandra Bellamy, the celebrated beauty of the family, daughter of a marquess and darling of 3 London seasons, in order to settle an old debt of honor between their 2 houses. Julian had agreed because dying men should not be argued with, and because he told himself one woman was much like another when a man had already resigned his heart to duty rather than love. But something in him, some old, stubborn, unspoken thing, had refused to walk into that arrangement blind. He wanted, before he offered his name and his title and the whole architecture of his future, to see the woman he might marry when she believed no duke was watching. So he had come early, he had come disguised, he had come expecting to observe vanity dressed as virtue, the practiced elegance of a woman who had been raised to be chosen. What he had not expected was to find, on his second night at Bellamy Hall, an entirely different woman weeping alone on a garden swing at an hour when the great house behind her had gone dark and silent, as though she did not matter enough for anyone to notice she was missing. He should have turned and gone. Instead, he stepped forward, and a twig cracked beneath his boot, and the woman on the swing went rigid with the sudden, unmistakable posture of someone caught. "Who is there?" Her voice, when it came, trembled only slightly, and there was more courage in it than fear. She rose from the swing at once, smoothing her damp skirts, drawing herself up as though preparing to defend the garden itself. "Show yourself, sir, or I shall call for the dogs." "There are no dogs at Bellamy Hall, miss," Julian said, stepping into the thin moonlight with his hands raised, palms open, in the universal gesture of a man who means no harm. Only an old groundsman who could not sleep and did not think to find anyone else awake at this hour. She studied him for a long moment, and he found himself grateful for the darkness, which hid more of his face than it revealed. He watched her decide, in the space of a breath, that he was no threat, a servant, like herself, dressed plainly, his voice low and unhurried, something in her shoulders eased. "Forgive me," she said. "I did not mean to alarm you. I often come out at this hour. The house is quieter here." "You were crying." It was not a question, and he watched her flinch at the bluntness of it, watched her lift her chin, the way a person does when they are deciding whether to lie. "I was thinking of my father," she said finally, and there was something in the plainness of her honesty that struck him harder than any performance of grief could have. "He is unwell, and far from here, and I cannot go to him." "I am sorry," Julian said, and meant it more than he had meant anything he had said since arriving at that house. "May I ask your name?" She hesitated again. "Elara," she said. "Elara Winthrop. I am companion to Miss Bellamy, a cousin of the family, though a distant and unimportant one." She said this last part without bitterness, as though it were simply a fact of weather, the way one might note that it had rained. "Julian Hale," he said, and the lie sat strangely in his mouth even as he offered it, because for the first time in his life he found himself wishing he could give a woman his true name and watch what she did with it. "Groundsman, new to the house, as of this week." "Then we are both strangers here," Elara said, and something that was almost a smile touched her mouth, quick and startled, as though she had forgotten she still possessed the capacity for one. "Though I have been a stranger here for 3 years, and you only a few days." 3 years is a long time to feel a stranger in one's own family's house. "They are not precisely my family," Elara said, and then seemed to catch herself, as though she had said more than she intended to a man she had known for the length of 5 sentences. "Forgive me, it is late, and I am tired, and I speak too freely to strangers in gardens." "I do not mind," Julian said, and it was, perhaps, the truest thing he had said all night. "I think it is a rare gift when someone speaks freely. Most people I meet say only what they believe I wish to hear." She looked at him curiously then, tilting her head, and for one unsettling moment he thought she might see straight through the plain coat and the borrowed name to the man beneath. But she only said, "That must be a lonely way to live, if no one ever tells you the truth." He did not answer. He had not expected a groundsman's disguise to draw out an observation so precisely, so unbearably accurate, that it lodged itself somewhere beneath his ribs and stayed there. "I should go in," Elara said, gathering her shawl tighter. "If my aunt wakes and finds me absent, there will be questions I would rather not answer." "Of course," Julian said. "Good night, Miss Winthrop." "Good night, Mr. Hale." She left him standing alone in the dark garden, and he did not move for a long while after she had gone, turning over in his mind the strange fact that he had come to Bellamy Hall to study one woman's character and found himself instead entirely occupied by another's. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself this again the following morning, and again at noon, and again when he saw her, properly in daylight, crossing the lower lawn with an armful of linens too heavy for a lady's arms to carry, her aunt's voice calling sharply after her from an upstairs window to hurry, hurry. Did she mean to keep Miss Cassandra waiting all morning for her hem to be mended? He watched from behind the hedge he was meant to be trimming, and understood, within the space of that single scene, everything he needed to know about how Elara Winthrop was treated in that house. She was not a poor relation, given shelter out of kindness. She was an unpaid servant given shelter in exchange for her labor, and dressed in the language of family only when it was convenient for the Bellamys to pretend at generosity in front of guests. That evening, at the long table in the servants' hall where Julian took his meals in character, he learned more. The housekeeper, a stout, gossiping woman named Mrs. Prescott, was only too happy to explain the household's arrangements to the new groundsman over a plate of cold mutton. Miss Winthrop, God love her, does the work of 2 maids and gets called family for it, which is worse, if you ask me, for a maid is paid and thanked, and she is neither, Mrs. Prescott said, shaking her head. Her father was a gentleman once, before he lost his fortune to bad investments and worse friends. Her mother's people were the Bellamys, so when he could no longer keep her, they took her in. took her in the way one takes in a dog too old to sell, if you follow me. She mends Miss Cassandra's gowns, she reads to Lady Bellamy when her eyes tire, she manages the household accounts that her ladyship is too grand to trouble with, and in return she is fed, housed, and reminded daily that she ought to be grateful. "And Miss Cassandra?" Julian asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "What is she like?" Mrs. Prescott's mouth pursed. "Beautiful," she said, in the tone of a woman choosing her words with great care. "Beautiful, and knows it, and has been told so since the cradle. There is a duke expected to call on the family before the season's end. Everyone below stairs knows it, though it is meant to be a great secret, and Miss Cassandra has spoken of nothing else for a month. She means to be a duchess, Mr. Hale, and I do not think anything short of that will satisfy her now." Julian said nothing, but something cold settled in his chest at the thought of the woman he had promised his father he would marry, speaking of his own title as though it were a prize to be won rather than a man to be known. He thought, that night, of Elara's plain honesty in the garden, the way she had spoken of loneliness without performing it, the way she had guessed, with uncanny accuracy, at the isolation beneath his disguise. He told himself he would observe both women equally, as he had come to do, and make his judgment with a clear head and a dutiful heart. He did not entirely succeed. There was, too, another matter Mrs. Prescott mentioned that first night, one Julian turned over in his mind for days afterward, with a growing unease he could not entirely name. Lady Bellamy, it seemed, had begun quiet correspondence with a widowed squire from the neighbouring county, a Mr. Ottaway, a man some 30 years Elara's senior, red-faced and prosperous from Wool, who had lost his wife the previous winter, and wanted, in Mrs. Prescott's blunt words, a young woman to keep his house and give him no trouble about it. Elara did not yet know of the arrangement being quietly stitched together above her head, but the servants did, and they spoke of it in low voices over the washing, the way people speak of a sentence not yet handed down but already written. "Her ladyship means to be rid of 2 burdens with 1 match," Mrs. Prescott said, lowering her voice further still. "The girl's keep, and the girl herself, before Miss Cassandra's wedding, brings fine company through these doors, who might ask awkward questions about a poor cousin still unmarried and underfoot." Julian said nothing to this, though something hardened in his chest at the thought of Elara being weighed and traded like an unwanted parcel, disposed of before she could become an inconvenience to anyone's carefully arranged future. He found himself watching her with even closer attention after that, not merely as a man drawn to a woman's quiet grace, but as a man beginning, whether he admitted it to himself or not, to feel the first stirrings of something fiercely protective. Over the following days, he found reasons, always plausible, always deniable, to be near the places where Elara worked. He trimmed the hedges outside the morning room where she sat with the household ledgers, her brow furrowed in concentration, her quill moving with a competence no one in that house seemed to notice or value. He repaired a garden gate near the kitchen door, where she came each afternoon to bring bread to an old dog no one else remembered to feed. He learned, in fragments, the shape of her days, how she rose before the rest of the house to see that the fires were lit, how she absorbed her aunt's sharp words without answering in kind, how she still, somehow, found gentleness enough to spare for a servant's child who had cut her hand on a broken teacup, kneeling in the dust of the kitchen yard to bind the wound herself. He began to understand that Elara Winthrop's dignity was not the practiced dignity of a woman raised to expect deference. It was something harder won, and to his eyes, infinitely more valuable, the dignity of a woman who had been given every reason to become bitter and had chosen, each day, not to. Cassandra Bellamy, by contrast, revealed herself to him in smaller, sharper ways. She did not know the groundsman existed, except as an object to be ordered about. Fetch this, move that, why is the gravel not raked to my liking? And Julian found himself, disguise and all, treated with the particular carelessness of a woman who had never once in her life considered that a servant might have thoughts of his own. "You there," she said to him one afternoon, not troubling to learn his name, though he had given it to her twice. "The roses beneath my window have grown untidy. See that they are cut back before the Duke arrives. I will not have him think we keep a shabby garden." "Of course, Miss Bellamy," Julian said, and bowed, and thought, with a bleakness he had not expected to feel, of his father's dying request, and of the woman he had been promised to, for the sake of an old debt neither of them had chosen. The following week, Mr. Ottaway came to call. Julian, trimming a hedge within earshot of the drawing-room window by design rather than accident, listened as the squire's booming voice filled the house, praising the grounds, praising Lord Bellamy's excellent taste in port, and finally, with the bluntness of a man accustomed to purchasing what he wanted, inquiring after the quiet girl I glimpsed in the garden on my last visit, Miss Winthrop, I believe. A sensible sort of woman, just the kind to manage a widower's house without complaint. Lady Bellamy's reply was warm with an eagerness that made Julian's jaw tighten. "She is a most obliging girl, Mr. Ottaway, and would want for nothing as your wife, but the good sense to be grateful for it." Elara was summoned to the drawing-room within the hour, and Julian watched her go, her spine straight, her face composed into the careful blankness she wore whenever she anticipated being spoken about, rather than spoken to. She emerged 3/4 of an hour later, considerably paler than she had gone in, and did not stop in the hall to speak with anyone, but went directly up the back stairs to the small room beneath the eaves that had, in 3 years, never once felt entirely like her own. That night she came to the garden later than usual, and when Julian rose from the stone wall to greet her, she did not manage even the ghost of her usual composure. "They mean to marry me to a man I have met twice," she said, before he could ask what troubled her, the words tumbling out of her with a rawness he had not yet heard from her. "A kind enough man, I do not doubt, in his own fashion, but a stranger nonetheless, 30 years my senior, who wants a housekeeper he need not pay, and calls it a wife. My aunt has all but promised him an answer within the month." "And what answer would you give, if the choice were yours alone?" Julian asked, though he feared he already knew, and feared still more what it would cost him to hear her say it aloud while he stood before her, wearing a name that was not his own. "I do not know that the choice has ever once been mine to give," Elara said, and there was no self-pity in it, only a bone-deep weariness that struck him harder than tears would have. "I have spent 3 years learning that my preferences are a luxury this house cannot afford to indulge. Perhaps it is foolish to expect this to be different." "It is not foolish," Julian said, low and fierce, "to want your own life to belong to you. It is the least foolish thing in the world." She looked at him then, with an expression he could not entirely read, gratitude perhaps, tangled together with something wearier and more frightened, as though she did not quite dare to let herself hope that a groundsman's opinion could matter against the combined weight of her aunt's ambitions and a widower's convenience. "You speak as though you have some power to change it, Mr. Hale," she said, with a small, sad attempt at lightness. "But we are neither of us in any position to defy this house. You are new here, and dependent on your wages, as I am dependent on my aunt's charity, however grudging it proves. We are both, in our different ways, at the mercy of people who have decided our worth for us." Julian said nothing to that, though the words lodged in him like a splinter, because he knew, as she did not, that he was in fact in a very great position to defy the house entirely, and the knowledge of his own concealed power sat uneasily against her quiet despair. He wanted, more than he had wanted anything in a long while, to tell her the truth then and there, to promise her that no widower and no scheming aunt would ever again decide the shape of her future. But he had not yet spoken to Cassandra. He had not yet untangled himself from his father's dying promise, and he feared, with a coward's clarity, that to reveal himself now, before he had the power to make good on any promise of his own, would be to offer her false hope, dressed in a duke's clothing, a cruelty no better than the one Lady Bellamy, was already preparing to inflict. "Give me a little time," he said instead, which was, he knew even as he said it, both true and maddeningly insufficient. "I do not think Mr. Ottaway's offer need be answered so quickly as your aunt believes." "You cannot delay my aunt's ambitions, Mr. Hale," Elara said, though something in her voice had softened, as though she wanted, despite everything, to believe him. "But I thank you for wishing you could." It was 3 nights later that he found Elara at the swing again. She did not weep this time, or she had already finished weeping by the time he arrived, her eyes red-rimmed in the moonlight, her hands folded very still in her lap. He came forward more openly now, no longer startling her, for they had fallen into the habit, unspoken but understood, of meeting in that garden after the house had gone to sleep. "You are troubled again," he said, settling onto the low stone wall near the swing, close enough to speak softly, far enough to respect what remained of propriety. "My father is worse," Elara said. "I had a letter today from the physician who attends him. He says I ought to come, if I wish to see him again while he still knows my face." Her voice caught, and she pressed her lips together, fighting the same battle he had watched her fight a dozen times now, the battle against being seen to break. "But I cannot go. My aunt says my duties here cannot be spared, and I have no money of my own for the journey, and no one to escort me even if I found the means." "That is a cruelty," Julian said, before he could stop himself, dressed as practicality. Elara looked at him, startled by the heat in his voice. "You speak as though you have some quarrel with practicality yourself, Mr. Hale." "I have a quarrel with people who use the word to excuse unkindness," he said. "Your father is dying, and you are kept from him to hem gowns for a woman who does not know your name is Elara, and not merely you there." Her breath caught, and for a moment he feared he had said too much, revealed too much of the anger he had no right, as a groundsman, to feel on her behalf. But instead of drawing back, she laughed, a small, surprised, unguarded sound, the first true laugh he had heard from her. "You have been listening to Mrs. Prescott," she said. "I have been listening to everyone," Julian admitted. "It is remarkable what a man is told when the world believes him too humble to matter. That is a strange thing for a groundsman to say." "Is it?" He held her gaze a moment too long and felt the disguise strain against him like a coat grown too tight. "I think humble men notice more than grand ones give them credit for. We are not blinded by our own importance." She studied him again in that same searching way she had the first night, and he wondered, not for the first time, what she saw when she looked at him, whether some instinct in her sensed the lie beneath the plain coat, even if she could not name it. "You are unlike any groundsman I have known," she said at last, softly, almost to herself. "Perhaps I have had an unusual life," Julian said, which was, he reflected, the truest and least revealing thing he had said to her yet. They spoke for a long while that night, of small things, of the garden's history, of a book she had read twice for want of a new one, of the way the stars looked different, she said, from the window of her childhood home before her father's fortune failed. Julian found himself telling her, in careful fragments disguised as a servant's borrowed memories, true things about his own life. The loneliness of losing a parent while still owing that parent obedience, the strange grief of inheriting duties he had never chosen, the particular ache of being surrounded by people who wanted things from him, and almost no one who wanted merely to know him. "You speak as though you carry a great weight, Mr. Hale," Elara said gently, when he fell silent. "Perhaps I do," he said, "though I find it lighter, somehow, in this garden." She did not ask him to explain, and he was grateful, because he did not think he could have answered her without breaking the fragile, dangerous thing that had begun to grow between them, a thing built, he understood even then, on a foundation of deception that could not last. He told himself, each night, that he would end it soon. He would reveal himself, apologize for the disguise, explain his father's dying wish and the arrangement that bound him to Cassandra. He told himself this the next night, and the night after that, and each time he found Elara waiting at the swing, some fragile hope in her eyes when she saw him approach. He lost his nerve entirely and stayed instead to listen to her speak, to watch the moonlight catch the tired grace of her face, to feel, for 1 hour out of each long day, entirely and simply himself. It was Cassandra who forced the matter, in the end, though she did not know it. She had grown impatient. Word had reached her, through channels Julian never fully traced, though he suspected her maid had overheard something from a groom who had recognized, on a visit to a neighboring estate, a crest on a trunk that should never have been unpacked within sight of the house, that the Duke of Ravensmere was not merely expected at Bellamy Hall, but already present, in disguise, somewhere on the grounds. Cassandra did not know which of the men on the estate he might be, but she knew enough to begin behaving toward every servant and tradesman who crossed her path with a sudden and suspicious excess of charm, testing each one for some flicker of aristocratic bearing beneath the borrowed clothes. She found Julian in the stable yard on a grey afternoon, and something in the way she looked at him, assessing, calculating, entirely too intent for a woman addressing a groundsman, told him his time was shorter than he had hoped. "Mr. Hale," she said, drawing out his false name with a strange emphasis, "you have been at Bellamy Hall some weeks now. Tell me, do you find the house much changed by grand visitors when they come?" "I could not say, Miss Bellamy," Julian answered carefully. "I have not yet seen a grand visitor arrive." "Have you not?" Her eyes, pale and sharp, did not leave his face. "How curious. I had thought perhaps one had come already and simply not announced himself." Julian held her gaze, giving nothing away, though his pulse had quickened with the particular alarm of a man who senses a trap closing before he can see its shape. "I am only a groundsman, Miss Bellamy," he said. "I would not know a duke from a farmer if the truth were told." Cassandra's smile was thin. How fortunate for the duke, then, that he has found so discreet a household to hide in. She left him with that, and Julian understood, watching her walk away, that whatever game she was playing, she meant to win it, and that Elara, innocent of all of it, stood directly in the path of whatever Cassandra chose to do next. He was right to fear it. 3 days later, the true Duke of Ravensmere's arrival was announced, not by Julian himself, but by his own steward, Mr. Fenwick, who arrived at Bellamy Hall in a coach bearing the ducal crest, apologizing profusely to Lady Bellamy for the confusion, explaining that His Grace had, for reasons of his own discretion, chosen to survey the estate beforehand under a borrowed name, and would present himself properly that very evening. The house fell into an uproar of preparation. Lady Bellamy nearly fainted from the shock of having unknowingly served mutton to a duke in her own servants' hall. Cassandra, far from being surprised, wore the satisfied expression of a woman whose suspicions had been confirmed, and began at once dressing for the evening, as though she had known all along precisely which of the household's newest arrivals wore a crown beneath his collar. Elara heard the news from Mrs. Prescott, in the kitchen, over a tray of tea things she had been carrying up to Lady Bellamy's room. She heard it, and something in her went very still and very cold as the pieces arranged themselves in her mind with terrible clarity. "Groundsman, new to the house, as of this week, I have had an unusual life. Humble men notice more than grand ones give them credit for." She set the tray down very carefully, so as not to let it shake in her hands, and went to find him. She found him in the stable yard, no longer in the plain coat she had known, but in clothes that could not disguise what he was, clothes of fine cloth and careful cut, a signet ring on his hand that caught the fading light. He turned when he heard her step, and whatever he saw in her face made the color drain from his own. "Elara, Your Grace," she said, and the words came out of her like something torn, formal and cold, in a way she had never once spoken to him before, even on their first strange meeting in the dark. "I did not know I had been keeping a duke company in the garden at midnight." "Let me explain." You let me speak to you as though you were an equal, Elara said, her voice shaking now despite her effort to hold it steady. You let me tell you of my father, of my grief, of things I have told no one else in this house in 3 years, and all the while you were testing me. Weren't you, watching me the way one watches an animal at market, to see whether it is worth the price? No, Julian said, and stepped toward her, though she stepped back at once, putting the stable door between them like a shield. It began that way, I will not lie to you. I came here to observe Cassandra, as my father's dying promise required of me, and I meant only to see the household as it truly was, before I offered my name to any of it. But Elara, what grew between us in that garden was never a test. It became the truest thing in my life. How am I to know that, Elara said, when everything you have told me since the night we met has been a lie? Not everything, Julian said, not the things that mattered. You do not understand, Elara said, and her voice broke at last, the composure she had guarded so carefully cracking open. You are a duke, sir. You may test 100 women in 100 gardens and lose nothing by it but a little time. I am a poor relation with no fortune and no protection, and I have just been told, by the man I believed cared for my heart, that he allowed me to fall in love with a groundsman who did not exist, while all along he was promised, sir, before he ever set foot on this land, to my cousin. What am I to do with that? What is left for me now, but to be laughed at below stairs for my foolishness, and above stairs for my presumption? She turned and left him before he could answer, and Julian, Duke of Ravensmere, stood alone in the stable yard, with his hands empty and his heart in ruins, and understood, for the first time since his father's death, exactly what it meant to lose something he had never had the courage to claim while he still could. That evening, Bellamy Hall assembled its finest for the Duke's formal reception, and Julian moved through it as though under water, bowing to Lady Bellamy, accepting Lord Bellamy's effusive apologies for the earlier confusion, enduring Cassandra's radiant, triumphant smile as she took her place at his side, with the easy confidence of a woman who believed the matter already settled. Elara was not present. She had been given leave, or perhaps simply told, to remain above stairs and attend to Lady Bellamy's correspondence instead of joining the gathering, and Julian understood, watching the empty place at the edge of the room where a poor relation might once have stood unnoticed, that this too was a form of cruelty, dressed as practicality, that the family had no wish for the Duke's eye to fall, even by accident, on a woman they had already decided did not deserve his notice. He endured the evening as long as duty required, and then, when the dancing began and Cassandra's attention was claimed by a circle of admirers, eager to congratulate the future Duchess, he slipped away from the ballroom and climbed the stairs to the small, plain room where he had learned, from Mrs. Prescott's careless mention weeks before, that Elara Winthrop kept her few possessions and her private grief. He knocked. There was a long silence, and then her voice, tired and weary, told him to enter. She sat at a narrow desk beneath the window, a stack of correspondence before her eyes red from crying, though she made no effort now to hide it from him. There seemed little point, he thought, in pretending composure before a man who had already seen so much of what she tried to conceal. "You should not be here, Your Grace," she said, not looking up. "It is not proper." "I have never much cared for proper," Julian said, "when it stands between me and the truth." "The truth," Elara repeated, with a bitterness that cut him more than anger would have. "I have had a great deal of truth today, sir. I do not think I require more." "You require the truth I have not yet told you," Julian said, "which is that I came to this house prepared to marry a woman I did not love, because my father asked it of me with his dying breath, and I believed, as dying wishes so often demand, that duty must always outweigh desire. I have spent my whole life being told what I owed to my name, my title, my father's memory. I do not think, until I met you in that garden, that anyone had ever asked me what I wanted for myself." Elara's hands stilled on the papers before her, though she did not yet look up. I did not fall in love with you because you were easy to deceive or convenient to test, Julian went on, his voice roughening with the effort of saying what he had never said aloud to any living soul. I fell in love with you because you spoke to a stranger in a dark garden with more honesty and more courage than every polished woman I have met in every ballroom in London. I fell in love with you because you wept for your father and still found gentleness enough to bind a child's cut hand the very next morning. I fell in love with you, Elara, and I have been a coward these past weeks for not telling you so the moment I understood it, because I feared what it would cost me to admit that duty and desire had, for once in my life, pointed to the very same woman. And Cassandra? Elara asked, her voice very quiet. Cassandra wishes to be a duchess, Julian said. She has told me so herself, in as many words, though she has never once asked to know the man who holds the title. I do not think she has any more wish to marry me than I have to marry her. I think we are both, in our different ways, prisoners of an old promise made by men now dead, and I do not intend to spend the whole of my life paying a debt that was never truly mine to owe. Elara rose from the desk at last and turned to face him fully, and he saw, in the candlelight, the whole complicated war being fought behind her eyes, hope and hurt and disbelief, and something else beneath it all, something that looked, if he dared to name it, like love, struggling against its own fear. You deceived me, she said. I cannot pretend that did not happen, however sweetly you explain it now. No, Julian agreed. I cannot undo that, and I will not insult you by asking you to forget it. But I can promise you this. I will not deceive you again. Not about my name, not about my heart, not about anything that matters between us, for as long as you will allow me to remain in your life. You are still a duke, Elara said, and I am still nothing. A poor relation, with no dowry, no fortune, no name worth mentioning in the circles you must move in. Nothing has changed except that now I know the truth of what I am not. You are wrong, Julian said, closing the distance between them at last, his voice fierce with a certainty that surprised even him. You are the truest woman I have ever known. You are the only person in this house who has ever spoken to me without calculating what I might give them for it. If that is nothing, Elara, then I have spent my whole life surrounded by nothing dressed in silk and jewels, and I would rather have you, in your darned grey shawl, than every glittering woman in England. For a long moment she said nothing, and he feared he had lost her, that the wound of his deception had cut too deep to be reached by any words he could offer. But then she pressed her hand to her mouth, and he saw the tears come again, different this time, not the private grief he had watched from behind the hedge, but something that broke and mended in the same breath. You cannot simply say such things and expect the world to rearrange itself around them, she whispered. There is Cassandra. There is your promise to your father. There is my aunt, who will never permit. Let me worry about the world, Julian said gently. I have not asked you to solve it. I have only asked you to tell me whether, if I could clear every obstacle between us, you would have me, not as a duke, but as the man who sat with you on a garden wall and told you more truth than he had ever told another living soul. Elara looked at him for a long, searching moment, and then, very softly, she said, I would. It was not the end of the difficulty, of course, nothing so complicated as an old promise between two families unraveled in a single midnight confession. Cassandra, when she learned the true shape of things the following morning, did not weep or plead, for she was not a woman given to weeping over what she had never truly wanted for its own sake, only for what it would have brought her. But her mother, Lady Bellamy, was a different matter entirely, and the days that followed brought a storm of outrage, threats of ruined reputation, accusations flung at Elara for what Lady Bellamy called, in her coldest voice, an ungrateful girl's scheme to trap a duke through false humility and calculated tears. You will leave this house, Lady Bellamy told her, on the third morning after the truth had broken over the household like a summer storm. I will not have it said that I raised a serpent beneath my own roof, plotting to steal what belonged, by every right of birth and beauty, to my own daughter. I plotted nothing, Elara said, and for the first time in 3 years, she did not lower her eyes when she spoke to her aunt. I wept in a garden because I believed myself entirely alone, and a man happened to hear me. If that is a scheme, then grief itself is a scheme, and honesty is a weapon, and I confess I do not know how to be other than I am. Then you will learn the cost of it, Lady Bellamy said, beginning with the loss of this roof over your head. It was Julian who intervened, arriving that same afternoon with a formality he had not troubled to use since his arrival at Bellamy Hall, dressed now fully as the Duke he was, his steward, and 2 footmen, in ducal livery, standing at his back, like a wall of consequence Lady Bellamy could not pretend to ignore. Lady Bellamy, he said, with the particular coldness of a man whose patience for cruelty has finally run out, I understand you mean to turn Miss Winthrop out of this house. She has behaved with a want of gratitude that cannot be tolerated, Your Grace, Lady Bellamy said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier heat in the presence of the title she had so recently learned to fear as much as covet. I have watched, these past weeks, precisely how much gratitude has been demanded of Miss Winthrop in exchange for the roof over her head, Julian said. I have watched her rise before dawn to see to your fires, mend your daughter's gowns, manage your household accounts unpaid and unthanked, and comfort a dying father's letters in the privacy of a garden because she had no one within these walls to comfort her instead. I do not think gratitude is the quality lacking in this house, Lady Bellamy. I think it is kindness, and I find I have very little patience remaining for households that lack it. Lady Bellamy paled and began some flustered protest about family duty and proper feeling, but Julian was no longer listening. He turned instead to Elara, who stood in the doorway with her small trunk already half packed at her feet, as though she had expected this outcome and prepared for it before anyone else in the room had finished arguing. You need not stay another hour in a house that has never valued you, he said. I have arranged a carriage. If you wish it, I will see you safely to your father's side myself, that you may sit with him as long as he has need of you, with no household duties and no unkind aunt to call you back before you are ready. And after? Elara asked, though her eyes were already bright with something that was not entirely grief. After, Julian said, I intend to ask you a question I have been rehearsing since a night in a dark garden when a woman told me a lonely life was no way to live. I do not intend to ask it while you are still grieving, or still uncertain of your welcome, or still standing in a house that has made you doubt your own worth. I will ask it when you are ready to hear it, and not one moment before. Elara's father, when Elara reached him 3 days later, with the Duke's own physician in attendance, and the Duke's own carriage waiting patiently outside, lived long enough to know that his daughter would never again want for care, or comfort, or a roof that welcomed, rather than merely tolerated her. He died peacefully, a fortnight later, holding his daughter's hand, having extracted from the Duke of Ravensmere, with the particular fierce protectiveness of a dying father for a daughter he had failed to shelter in life, a promise that he would love her not out of duty, nor out of the strange debt of a midnight garden confession, but for the whole of the woman she was, plainly and completely, for as long as they both should live. Julian gave that promise gladly, and meant to keep it in every particular. And yet even grief tended, and love declared, do not erase in a single night the wound of having been, however briefly, deceived. In the weeks that followed her father's death, while Elara remained in the small house, settling what little of his estate could be salvaged, she asked Julian for time apart. Not a refusal, she was careful to tell him, but a need to know her own heart clearly, uncrowded by grief on one side and a duke's sudden, overwhelming attention on the other. I have spent 3 years learning to want very little, she told him, on the last evening before he left her to that solitude, so that I might never be disappointed by wanting too much. I find I am not yet certain how to want a whole life, Julian, without some part of me waiting for it to be taken away again. He did not argue with her, though it cost him more than she perhaps understood to leave her there, in that small, quiet house, and return alone to the vast rooms of Ravensmere, where every corridor seemed, in her absence, to echo with a silence he had not minded until he had known what its opposite felt like. He wrote to her, not the practiced correspondence of courtship, full of pretty phrases meant to persuade, but honest letters, the kind he might have written to no one else alive, telling her of small things, a dog on the estate that had taken to following him on his rounds, a tenant's dispute he had settled that morning, the particular loneliness of a house too large for one man's grief and one man's hope to fill alone. She did not answer every letter at once. Some weeks brought only silence, and Julian, pacing the long gallery of his ancestral home beneath the painted eyes of dukes who had never once, so far as their portraits suggested, doubted their own worthiness of love, learned a new and uncomfortable humility, the humility of waiting for a woman's heart to arrive at its own conclusions, in its own time, without the power of his title to hurry her. When her answers did come, they were careful at first, and then, gradually, less so. A line here about her father's garden, now overgrown and in need of tending, a line there about a night she had lain awake, remembering the particular way moonlight had once fallen across a stone wall, where a groundsman had told her humble men notice more than grand ones give them credit for. He read that letter perhaps a dozen times before he trusted himself to answer it without saying too much too soon. It was 2 months before she wrote to him plainly, in a hand he had come to know as well as his own, that she believed she was ready, not to forget what he had concealed from her, for she did not think she ever entirely would, but to build something new atop the honest ground they had found together since, if he was still willing to build it with her. He was at her door within 2 days of receiving that letter, having ridden through a night of hard rain rather than wait for a carriage to be readied, and when she opened it to find him soaked through and travel-worn and entirely unconcerned with his own dignity, she laughed, the same unguarded laugh he had first coaxed from her in the dark garden months before, and he understood, in that single unguarded sound, that whatever doubt had lingered between them had finally, fully, dissolved. "You did not need to ride through a storm to prove your devotion, Your Grace," she said, drawing him in out of the rain. A dry carriage would have served the purpose equally well. "I find," Julian said, "that I have grown rather fond of arriving at your door exactly as I am, storms and all, and trusting you to let me in regardless." "I have learned," Elara said softly, "that this is precisely the sort of man worth letting in." The proposal, when it came not in a ballroom or a garden, but in the quiet sitting room of the small house where Elara had gone to settle her father's modest affairs, the two of them alone, but for the fire crackling low in the grate, and the last of the autumn light fading gold through the window. "I have no dowry," Elara said, when he knelt before her with a ring that had belonged, he told her, to his own mother, who had died when he was too young to remember her voice, but old enough to remember her kindness. "I have no fortune, no grand family name, nothing to bring a duke, but the plain truth of myself." "That," Julian said, "is the only dowry I have ever wanted, and the only one I would have accepted from any woman living. I do not need a duchess who knows how to manage a great house, Elara. I have stewards enough for that. I need a wife who will tell me the truth in a dark garden when no one else in the world will, who will weep honestly and laugh freely, and never once pretend to be less than she is, in order to make herself easier for the world to overlook. I have spent my whole life surrounded by people who wanted my title. I would like, for the rest of it, to be loved by someone who very nearly loved me before she knew I had one." "I did love you before I knew," Elara said, softly, through tears that were, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and simply happy. "I loved a groundsman named Julian Hale, who listened to my grief as though it mattered, and told me humble men notice more than grand ones give them credit for. I find I love the Duke rather less for his title, and rather more because he turned out, in the end, to be exactly the same man. "Then you will have me," Julian said, "title and all, though I promise you the title will trouble us far less than the man beneath it, who intends to spend every remaining year of his life proving that he was worth the risk of your trust." "I will have you," Elara said, and when he rose and drew her into his arms at last, in the fading gold light of that small, quiet room, there was no lie left standing between them, only the truth they had built, slowly and honestly, beginning on a night when a woman wept alone on a garden swing at midnight, entirely unaware that the man who would come to love her more than his own name was watching from the shadows, and had already, without knowing it himself, begun to fall. Their wedding, when it came the following spring, was held not in the grand cathedral of Ravensmere's ancestral seat, where every duke before him had married with pomp befitting his rank, but in the small stone chapel nearest the garden where they had first spoken, a choice Julian insisted upon over the mild protests of his steward, because he wished, he said, for their marriage to begin in the same honest quiet where their love had. Cassandra Bellamy did not attend, having secured, within a remarkably short span of months, an engagement to a wealthy baronet whose fortune, if not his title, satisfied her ambitions rather better than a duke who had never once looked at her the way he looked at her plain cousin. Lady Bellamy attended under strained but civil terms, having learned, in the intervening months, a certain caution about the cost of cruelty when one could never be entirely certain which overlooked relation might, in the end, prove to be the most valuable woman in the room. Elara wore, at her own quiet insistence, no elaborate gown of London fashion, but a simple dress of soft grey silk, the same colour, she told Julian with a smile, as the shawl she had worn the night he found her weeping and did not walk away. He thought, watching her come toward him down the short aisle of that small chapel with the spring light falling gold through old glass windows, that he had never in his life seen anything so entirely, unassailably beautiful, and he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has finally stopped running from his own heart, that every hour of disguise, every night of careful concealment, every risk of her anger and her grief had been worth it 1,000 times over for the chance to stand here now and call her, at last and forever, his own. That night, long after the wedding guests had gone and the great house had settled into its familiar quiet, Julian found Elara in the garden of their new home, seated on a swing beneath an old yew tree, not unlike the one where they had first spoken, her face turned up to the same wide sky of stars she had once told him looked different from her childhood window. "You are not crying tonight," he said, coming to sit beside her, taking her hand in his. "No," Elara said, smiling into the dark. "Tonight, I have nothing left to weep for. I have everything I did not dare to hope I might have, a home that welcomes me, a man who loves me exactly as I am, and no more midnight tears to hide from a garden I believed was empty." "I am glad of it," Julian said, "though I confess I have grown rather fond of this particular garden and the particular way moonlight falls across a swing at midnight." "Careful, Your Grace," Elara said, laughing softly, leaning her head against his shoulder as the chains of the swing creaked gently beneath them, "or I shall think you married me only for the view." "I married you," Julian said, pressing a kiss to her hair, "because on the loneliest night of your life you were still the truest, bravest, kindest woman I had ever met, and I have not for one single moment since then wished to be anywhere in the world but exactly here, beside you, in whatever garden you choose to call home." And there, beneath the same wide sky that had once witnessed her solitary grief, Elara Winthrop, who had spent 3 long years believing herself unwanted, overlooked, and unloved, sat instead in the arms of a man who had watched her weep alone and chosen, from that very first night, never to let her be alone again, and understood, at last, that some of the deepest loves in the world begin not in ballrooms full of admiring eyes, but in the quiet dark of a garden at midnight, where no one is watching except, perhaps, the one person who was always meant to find you there. In the years that followed, the servants at Ravensmere would sometimes speak, in the fond and knowing way of households that have witnessed a great love settle into an ordinary, happy life, of the new Duchess's peculiar fondness for gardens after nightfall, and of the Duke's habit of joining her there without fail, whatever the hour, whatever the weather, as though he could not entirely trust himself to let her sit alone beneath the stars even now, when there was nothing left in the world for either of them to hide, and no more midnight tears that did not, within moments, find someone waiting close beside them to help carry the weight. Elara kept, all her life, a small drawer in her writing desk where she folded away every letter Julian had ever sent her, beginning with the earliest careful lines written in the loneliness of a great house too large for one man's grief, and she would tell her own daughters, many years later, that a woman ought never to mistake a title for a man's worth, nor a man's silence for the absence of a heart, for she herself had once wept alone on a garden swing, certain that no one in the world cared enough to notice, and had been wrong in the very best and most unexpected way a person can be wrong, on the one night she least expected anyone to be watching at all.